I raised my son alone for most of his life, and for years, I carried that responsibility like a badge of honor, believing that every sacrifice I made was shaping him into a stronger, better man. I worked long hours, came home exhausted, and still found the energy to cook, clean, and make sure everything in his world felt stable, predictable, safe. I told myself that one day he would look back and understand everything I had done for him, that he would grow into someone responsible, someone grateful, someone who would stand on his own feet and maybe even take care of me the way I had taken care of him. That belief kept me going through years of quiet exhaustion, through moments when my body begged for rest but my mind refused to slow down, because being a mother meant pushing through, no matter what. And for a long time I truly believed I was doing the right thing. Until I realized I wasn't raising a man. I was raising someone who had learned that life would always be handled for him. When he turned 18, I thought things would start to change naturally, that adulthood would bring with it a sense of responsibility, a desire to contribute, a need to build something of his own. But nothing changed. If anything, things became more comfortable for him, because by then, the routine was already deeply rooted. He stayed up late, woke up whenever he wanted, and moved through the house like everything around him existed for his convenience. I kept telling myself he just needed time, that not everyone finds their path at the same pace, that pushing him too hard might do more harm than good. So I didn't push. I adjusted. I made things easier. And without realizing it, I removed every obstacle that could have forced him to grow. By the time he was 27, the situation had become something I could no longer ignore, even though I had spent years pretending it wasn't as bad as it looked. He didn't work, didn't study, didn't take responsibility for anything in the house, and yet somehow, he expected everything to be done for him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He would wake up close to noon, walk into the kitchen without saying good morning, and immediately ask what I had prepared, not if there was food, but what kind of food, as if effort, care, and time were things that simply existed without cost. And every time I answered. Every time I served. Because somewhere inside me, there was still a voice whispering that this was what a good mother did. She gave and gave and gave until there was nothing left to give. What hurt the most wasn't even the routine itself, but the way it had reshaped our relationship without me noticing. I was no longer someone he respected or even considered. I had become part of the system that supported him. Invisible when everything was working, noticeable only when something wasn't done the way he expected. And the more I tried to do things right, the more normal it became for him to demand more. It wasn't sudden. It didn't happen overnight. It was built slowly, through years of silence, through moments where I chose not to correct him, not to confront him, not to risk conflict. And that silence became the foundation of everything that came after. I remember the exact moment I started questioning everything, even though at the time it seemed small, almost insignificant. He had just woken up, walked into the kitchen, looked at the food I had prepared, and without even sitting down he said, "You could have made something better." There was no anger in his voice, no aggression, just a calm, casual dismissal of everything I had done that morning. And for a second I froze. Not because of what he said but because of how normal it sounded. That was when it hit me. This wasn't a bad day. This was who he had become. And somehow, I had helped create it. After that moment, something inside me refused to go back to the way things were, even though on the outside, everything continued exactly the same. I still woke up early, still moved through the kitchen quietly, still prepared meals the way I always had, but now there was a layer of awareness that hadn't been there before. It was like watching my own life from a distance, noticing details I had ignored for years, seeing patterns that once felt normal but now seemed impossible to justify. Every action I took began to feel heavier, not because it required more effort but because I finally understood what it meant. I wasn't just cooking. I was reinforcing a cycle. I wasn't just helping. I was enabling. And once you see something like that clearly, you can't pretend it's invisible again. That afternoon he did exactly what he always did. He woke up late, walked straight into the kitchen, opened the fridge without even looking at me, and started scanning for something that met his expectations. There was food, of course, carefully prepared, warm, ready, just like every day, but instead of acknowledging it, he frowned slightly and said, "There's no meat." Not a question out of curiosity, but out of disappointment, as if something essential had been missing. I stood there for a second, holding a dish towel in my hands, and for the first time I didn't rush to explain, didn't justify why I had made something simpler that day, didn't offer to fix it. I just said, "No," and even that small word felt unfamiliar coming out of my mouth. He looked at me, surprised, maybe even confused, because my silence didn't match the version of me he had grown used to. Normally, I would have already started adjusting, offering alternatives, asking what he wanted instead, but this time, I didn't move. And that moment, as simple as it was, created a tension that lingered in the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but present. He shrugged it off, grabbed something anyway, clearly unsatisfied, and sat down to eat, but the energy had shifted, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. And neither did I, not completely, but I could feel it. Something had changed, and it wasn't going back. Later that evening, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, the house unusually quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that makes you think, that forces you to face things you've been avoiding for years. I started replaying moments in my head, small interactions, comments, behaviors that I had dismissed or minimized, and for the first time I connected them all. It wasn't just about him being lazy, or unmotivated, or even disrespectful. It was about a pattern that had been allowed to grow without resistance, a dynamic that had never been corrected, because I had been too afraid of losing the relationship, not realizing that by avoiding conflict, I had already lost something far more important. That night I made a decision, not out of anger, not out of frustration, but out of something much quieter and much more powerful: clarity. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to confront him directly. I wasn't going to demand change or force anything. Because deep down, I knew that words wouldn't fix what had been built over years of behavior. Change wouldn't come from what I said. It would come from what I stopped doing. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what he needed. I was thinking about what had to end. The next morning, everything began exactly as it always had, but internally, nothing was the same. I woke up before the sun, out of habit, my body moving through the familiar routine without needing to think, but this time, each step felt different, almost deliberate. I stood in the kitchen, looking at the stove, the ingredients, the quiet space that had always been filled with urgency and responsibility. And for a few seconds I just stood there, not moving, not starting, not continuing the cycle. It felt uncomfortable at first, like I was breaking an unspoken rule, something that had defined my role in this house for years. But that discomfort didn't push me back into action. It made me pause even longer. Instead of preparing breakfast, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down, something I hadn't done in years without feeling guilty. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't planning his meal. I wasn't thinking about what he would say or whether he would be satisfied. I was just sitting there in silence, allowing myself to exist without serving a purpose for someone else. And that simple act, something so small and ordinary, felt almost unfamiliar, like I had forgotten what it meant to prioritize myself, even in the most basic way. For a moment, I questioned if I was doing the right thing, if I was being unfair, if I was somehow failing as a mother. But that voice didn't last long. Because another voice, quieter but stronger, reminded me of everything I had been ignoring. When he finally woke up, just like every other day, close to noon, I could hear his footsteps coming down the hallway, slow, careless, completely unaware that anything had changed. He walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, looked around and paused. There was food in the house, of course, but nothing prepared, nothing ready, nothing waiting for him the way it always had been. He stood there for a few seconds, probably expecting me to say something, to explain, to step in and fix it like I always did. But I didn't. I stayed seated, calm, quiet, present, but not involved. "Did you not cook anything?" he asked. his voice carrying a mix of confusion and irritation, as if this situation didn't make sense to him. I looked at him, not defensive, not apologetic, just honest, and said, "No, just that." No explanation, no elaboration, no emotional reaction. And that single word seemed to create a space between us that had never existed before. He wasn't used to that answer. He wasn't used to not having control over the outcome. And for a moment, he just stood there, looking at me, trying to understand what was happening. But I didn't give him anything else to work with. He grabbed something simple, something quick, something he clearly didn't want, and sat down to eat, but the energy in the room had changed completely. It wasn't about the food anymore. It was about the absence of what had always been there. My effort, my anticipation, my constant readiness to meet his expectations. And as I watched him quietly, I realized something important. This wasn't just about stopping a routine. This was about breaking a system. And systems don't collapse all at once. They start with small disruptions, moments that seem insignificant, but slowly begin to reshape everything. And that morning was the first real crack. That first day without preparing anything didn't end in an explosion, not the way I imagined it might in my mind during all those nights I had spent thinking about change. Instead, it unfolded quietly, almost deceptively calm, as if the house itself was waiting to see what would happen next. He stayed in his room for most of the afternoon, probably expecting me to eventually give in, to walk back into the kitchen and resume everything as if nothing had happened. And in the past I would have. I would have felt the tension, the discomfort, and rushed to fix it, convincing myself that peace was more important than anything else. But this time I didn't move. I let the silence exist. By early evening, he came back into the kitchen, this time with a different energy. Not confusion anymore, but irritation. He opened cabinets louder than necessary, moved things around with more force than usual, making sure I could hear every movement, every sign of his dissatisfaction. It wasn't about finding food. It was about provoking a reaction. And for years that had always worked. I would hear the noise, feel the tension, and step in to calm things down before they escalated. But now, I understood something I hadn't seen clearly before. Reacting was part of the system. My response had always been the reward. He finally turned to me, leaning against the counter, arms crossed, and said, "So this is how it's going to be now?" His tone wasn't loud, but it carried expectation, as if he was giving me one last chance to correct what he believed was a mistake. I looked at him, steady, without anger, without hesitation, and said, "This is how it is." Not aggressive, not defensive. Just firm. And that firmness created something new between us. Not distance, but resistance. Because for the first time, he wasn't speaking to someone who would adjust to his tone. He was speaking to someone who had already decided. That was when the frustration started to show more clearly. He shook his head, let out a short, dismissive laugh, and said, "That doesn't make any sense." And maybe, in his world, it didn't. Because his reality had always been built around the idea that things would be done for him, that his needs would be anticipated, that his comfort was part of how the house functioned. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't try to make him understand. Because I knew something he didn't. Understanding wasn't necessary for change to begin. Experience was. He left the kitchen shortly after that, but this time the energy didn't return to what it had been before. There was something unsettled now, something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed as a one-time situation. And as I sat there in the same place I had been all day, I realized that the hardest part wasn't what he was feeling. It was what I was refusing to feel. The guilt. The instinct to fix things. The urge to go back to what was familiar. That urge was still there, quiet but persistent, trying to convince me that I was doing something wrong. But I stayed where I was. Because for the first time I understood something clearly. If I gave in now, nothing would ever change. The next day didn't bring resolution. It brought tension. The kind of tension that doesn't explode right away, but lingers in the air, subtle, persistent, waiting for the right moment to surface. I woke up again before sunrise, but this time there was no hesitation. The doubt that had tried to creep in the day before was quieter now, weaker, as if it had already started losing its grip on me. I moved through the house slowly, calmly, doing only what was necessary for myself. Nothing more, nothing extra, nothing that fed the system I had finally decided to break. And even though everything felt unfamiliar, there was something underneath it all that felt steady, like I was finally standing on something solid. When he woke up, the reaction was different. There was no confusion this time. No pause. No expectation that things would go back to normal. Instead, there was frustration already waiting for him, already built up from the day before. He walked into the kitchen with a heavier step, opened the fridge more aggressively, and this time he didn't even look at me before speaking. "So you're still doing this," he said, his voice sharper now, less controlled. And I noticed something important in that moment. He wasn't asking. He was challenging. I looked at him, calm, grounded, not trying to match his energy, and said, "Yes." Just that. No explanation, no defense, no justification. And that simplicity seemed to frustrate him even more. Because arguments require engagement, and I wasn't giving him anything to work with. No emotional reaction, no escalation, no resistance he could push against. Just a boundary. Quiet, but immovable. That's when the tone shifted. "This is ridiculous," he said, running his hand through his hair, pacing slightly as if the situation itself didn't make sense to him. "You're my mother. You're supposed to take care of me." And those words, they didn't shock me. They didn't hurt me the way they might have before. Instead, they confirmed something I had already begun to understand. This wasn't just about habit. This was belief. He truly believed that my role in his life was to serve him, regardless of his age, regardless of his responsibility, regardless of anything else. I took a breath, not to calm myself, but to make sure my words came from clarity, not emotion. And then I said something I had never said before, something that had been building quietly inside me for years without ever finding its way out. "I did take care of you," I said, my voice steady, firm but not raised. "That part is over." And as soon as the words left my mouth, I felt something shift inside me. Not tension, not fear, but release. Because for the first time I wasn't just thinking differently. I was speaking it. And once something like that is said out loud, it changes everything. The moment those words settled in the air, I could see something change in his expression, not immediately, not in a dramatic way, but subtly, like a crack forming beneath the surface. He wasn't used to hearing that from me. He was used to adjustments, to explanations, to soft responses that could be negotiated, reshaped, or ignored entirely. But this was different. This wasn't an emotional reaction that would fade in a few minutes. This was a statement. And statements don't disappear just because they're uncomfortable. For a few seconds, he didn't say anything. He just stared at me, as if trying to understand whether I meant it or if this was just another moment that would pass. And I didn't fill the silence. I didn't soften it. I didn't step in to ease the discomfort like I had done so many times before. I let it sit between us, heavy and real, because I knew that discomfort was necessary. Growth doesn't happen in comfort. And neither does change. Then came the reaction I had expected, just not in that exact moment. He shook his head, let out a short laugh and said, "You're overreacting." His tone wasn't loud, but it carried dismissal, the kind that tries to minimize something before it can fully take shape. And for years that would have worked. I would have second-guessed myself, questioned whether I was being too harsh, too emotional, too unfair. But this time, that doubt didn't take hold, because this wasn't about reacting. It was about correcting something that had been wrong for a long time. "I'm not overreacting," I said calmly without raising my voice, without adding anything unnecessary. And again, that simplicity seemed to frustrate him more than any argument ever could. Because there was nothing to push against. No emotion to manipulate. No guilt to trigger. Just a boundary that didn't move. That's when the frustration finally broke through more clearly. "So what, you're just not going to do anything now?" he asked, his voice sharper, his posture more tense, as if he was trying to force a reaction out of me. And I realized something in that moment. This wasn't just about food or chores or routine. This was about control. About losing something he had never even realized he depended on. "I'm going to do what I need to do," I answered, steady, grounded. "You'll have to do the same." And those words didn't end the conversation. But they ended something else. The version of me that had always been available, always adjusting, always stepping in. That version was gone. And even though he didn't fully understand it yet, he could feel it. That day didn't settle into anything peaceful or resolved. It stretched, slow and uncomfortable, like something unfinished hanging in the air. He stayed around the house longer than usual, not because he had anything to do, but because he didn't know what to do. Without the routine he had always relied on, even his idle time seemed different, almost restless, like he was waiting for something that wasn't coming. I noticed the way he moved from room to room, checking things, opening doors, pacing slightly, as if the house itself had changed overnight, and he was trying to understand why it no longer felt the same. And in a way, it had. By the afternoon, the tension began to take a different form. It wasn't direct anymore. It wasn't questions or complaints. It was something quieter, more strategic. He started making small comments as he walked past me, not enough to start an argument, but enough to provoke a reaction. "Must be nice to just sit around," he said at one point, not even looking directly at me, as if the words were just floating in the room. Another time, he sighed loudly while opening the fridge, shaking his head as if he were the one dealing with something unreasonable. These weren't random behaviors. They were attempts. Attempts to pull me back into the dynamic we had always had. And I recognized it immediately. Not because it was new, but because I had been responding to it for years without realizing it. Those small comments, those passive reactions, they were hooks. Designed to trigger guilt, to make me feel responsible, to bring me back into motion. But this time I didn't take the bait. I didn't respond. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I stayed exactly where I was, present, aware, but untouched by the pattern he was trying to restart. And the more I didn't react, the more visible his frustration became. By early evening, the subtle approach no longer worked, and I could feel the shift building again. He walked into the room with more intention this time, no longer pretending that everything was normal. "You're really just going to sit there and act like nothing's wrong," he said, his voice carrying a mix of irritation and disbelief. And for a moment I looked at him, really looked at him, not as someone I needed to manage, not as someone I needed to protect, but as a grown man standing in front of me, frustrated because things were no longer being done for him. "Nothing is wrong," I said calmly. "Things are just different." And that answer seemed to land in a way the others hadn't. Because it didn't deny his experience. But it also didn't validate his expectations. Simply stated a new reality. And reality, when it changes, doesn't ask for permission. Just becomes. He stood there for a few seconds, searching for something else to say. Something that would shift the situation back in his favor. But nothing came out. And that silence. That was new. Not just for him but for both of us. Because for the first time there was no immediate resolution. No return to what was familiar. There was just a space. Where things had to either change or break. By the next morning, the tension had settled into something heavier, no longer uncertain, no longer experimental, but real. This wasn't a phase anymore. This was a shift. And he felt it. I could see it in the way he moved through the house, less careless, less relaxed, as if something invisible had been removed, and he was only now realizing how much he depended on it. He didn't come into the kitchen immediately this time. He stayed in his room longer than usual, maybe waiting, maybe hoping that things would quietly return to what they were. But they didn't. And eventually reality forced him out. When he finally walked in, there was no question, no greeting, no attempt to pretend things were normal. He went straight to the fridge, opened it, stared inside for a few seconds, then closed it harder than necessary. That sound echoed more than it should have, not because it was loud, but because of what it carried. Frustration turning into anger. He grabbed something simple again, something quick, something he clearly didn't want, but this time he didn't sit down calmly. He stayed standing, eating without patience, without care, as if the act itself irritated him. "You're really serious about this," he said after a few seconds. His voice flat, controlled, but underneath it, there was something else building. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I had learned that silence, when used with intention, says more than any explanation ever could. I took another sip of my coffee, looked at him briefly, and then simply nodded. And that small gesture, that confirmation without emotion, seemed to push him closer to the edge. "What's the point of this?" he continued, this time louder, not shouting, but no longer trying to hide the irritation. "You're making things harder for no reason." And that sentence revealed something important. In his mind, the problem wasn't his behavior. The problem was the change, the inconvenience, the disruption of comfort. And that's when I understood something even deeper. He didn't see this as a consequence. He saw it as an attack. "I'm not making anything harder," I said calmly. "I'm just not doing it for you anymore." And again the words were simple, but they carried weight. Because they removed any illusion that this was temporary. This wasn't about a bad day or a mood. This was a decision. That was when the reaction finally shifted. He laughed, but it wasn't amusement. It was disbelief mixed with frustration. "So what, I'm supposed to just figure everything out now?" he asked, almost mocking the idea, as if it were unrealistic, unreasonable, unfair. And I looked at him, steady, grounded, and said something that, for him, probably sounded harsher than anything I had ever said before. Even though my tone never changed. "Yes. Just that. No explanation. No comfort. No softening." And in that moment, something inside him broke slightly. Not completely. Not yet. But enough for the reality to start settling in. Because for the first time in his life, no one was going to fix it for him. That single word didn't just end the conversation. It started something else. I could see it in the way his posture changed, in the way his expression hardened slightly, like he was shifting from confusion into resistance. Acceptance wasn't coming yet. Not even close. What came first was pushback. Because people don't let go of comfort easily, especially when they've never had to earn it. They fight for it. They test it. They try to bend reality back into what they know. And that's exactly what he started doing. For the rest of that day, the house didn't feel like a home. It felt like a silent standoff. He stayed around more than usual, not because he wanted to be there, but because he didn't want to leave without re-establishing some level of control. He kept moving through shared spaces, sitting where I could see him, making his presence known in subtle ways, as if proximity alone could pressure me into reacting. But I didn't engage. I didn't acknowledge those attempts. I stayed grounded in what I had already decided because I knew something important. The moment I responded emotionally, even slightly, the system would try to rebuild itself. By late afternoon, he changed his approach. The frustration didn't disappear. It adapted. He came into the room more calmly this time, sat down across from me, and spoke in a tone that almost sounded reasonable, almost cooperative. "Look," he said, leaning forward slightly, "if something's bothering you, we can just fix it. You don't have to act like this." And for a second I almost smiled. Not out of amusement but out of recognition. Because this wasn't concern. This was negotiation. An attempt to reset the dynamic without actually changing anything. "I'm not acting," I said quietly. "I've just stopped doing what I shouldn't have been doing for a long time." And that answer didn't give him what he wanted. It didn't open space for compromise. It didn't invite discussion. It closed the door he was trying to reopen. He leaned back, exhaling sharply, and for a moment the calm tone dropped. "So what, you're just going to sit there and do nothing while I struggle?" he said, his voice rising slightly, now carrying frustration again. And that question, it revealed something deeper than anger. It revealed expectation. The belief that his struggle was my responsibility. "I'm not stopping you from doing anything," I replied, steady, without hesitation. "You're just not used to doing it yourself." And that sentence landed differently. Because it didn't accuse. It didn't attack. It simply exposed something he hadn't wanted to face. There was a pause after that. A real one. Not filled with tension or noise. But with something heavier. Reality settling in, slowly, whether he liked it or not. And for the first time since all of this started, he didn't have an immediate response. No argument. No comeback. Just silence. And in that silence, something important was happening. Not change yet, but the beginning of it. The silence that followed that conversation didn't bring peace. It brought strategy. I could feel it. Not in something obvious. Not in words or actions that could be pointed out directly. But in the way he began to move, to observe, to measure what might still work. Because when direct control fails, people often turn to something more subtle. Emotional pressure. And he knew me well enough to know where that pressure usually worked best. That evening, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't complain about the food. He didn't challenge me directly. Instead, he changed his tone completely. Softer. Slower. Almost reflective. He sat down in the living room not too far from me, and after a long pause he said, "I don't understand why you're doing this now, after everything." His voice carried something different this time. Not anger, not frustration, but something that sounded like disappointment. And for a moment I felt it. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. That tone, it was familiar. It was the tone that used to make me question myself. "I've always been here," he continued, looking down, avoiding direct eye contact, as if the weight of the situation was finally affecting him. "I've never asked for much." And that sentence, that one almost reached me. Not because it was true, but because of what it was trying to trigger. Guilt. The idea that I was suddenly withholding something unfairly, that I was changing the rules without warning, that somehow I was the one creating the problem. But something inside me stayed still. Because for the first time, I wasn't listening only to his words. I was listening to the pattern behind them. "You've asked for everything," I said quietly, not aggressively, not defensively, just clearly. "You just never had to say it out loud." And that response shifted the moment immediately. The softness he had created didn't hold. Because it wasn't built on truth. It was built on influence. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a brief second I saw something different in his eyes. Not anger. Not frustration. Something closer to realization. But it didn't stay. Because acceptance is harder than resistance. And people don't move toward it easily. "So now I'm the bad guy," he said, his tone changing again, sharper this time, defensive. And there it was. The pivot. From guilt to blame. From "I don't understand" to "you're wrong." And I didn't follow him there. "This isn't about good or bad," I said calmly. "This is about what's real." And that answer didn't give him anything to hold on to. No emotional leverage. No argument to twist. Just a truth that didn't bend. He stood up shortly after that, frustrated again, the calm approach abandoned, because it hadn't worked the way he expected. And as he walked away, I realized something important. This wasn't just difficult for him. It was unfamiliar. Because for the first time in his life, I wasn't responding to who he wanted me to be. I was responding to what was actually happening. The next few days didn't bring resolution. They brought pressure. Not the kind that explodes all at once, but the kind that builds slowly, quietly, until it becomes impossible to ignore. And I could see it taking shape in him, even when he tried to hide it. His movements were different now, less relaxed, less careless. The confidence he used to carry inside the house, that quiet certainty that everything would be handled for him, was no longer there. In its place, there was tension. Not fully visible, not fully acknowledged, but present in everything he did. He started leaving the house more often, but not with purpose. It wasn't work, it wasn't direction. It was escape. He would go out for hours, come back with cheap food, sometimes barely enough, sometimes clearly not what he wanted, but he said nothing about it. And that silence was louder than any complaint he had made before. Because it wasn't acceptance. It was resistance turning inward. The kind that doesn't ask for help, doesn't admit difficulty, but also doesn't know how to move forward. One evening, he came back later than usual, holding a small bag of food, the kind you buy when you don't have many options. He walked past me without saying anything, sat down and started eating quietly. No comments, no complaints, no attempts to provoke a reaction. And for a moment I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not frustration, not anger, but discomfort that had nowhere to go. Because for the first time, he wasn't just reacting to a change. He was experiencing the weight of it. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask where he had been, what he had done, or how he was feeling. Not because I didn't care, but because I understood something I hadn't understood before. Stepping in now would interrupt something important. Growth doesn't come from being rescued. Comes from being allowed to face reality without interference. And that reality was finally reaching him, slowly, in ways words never could. After he finished eating, he sat there for a while, staring at the table, not moving, not speaking. And then, almost quietly, almost reluctantly, he said, "This is stupid." Not directed at me, not loud, not aggressive. Just a statement, as if he needed to say something to break the silence. But even in that sentence, there was less certainty than before. Because deep down, something had already started to shift. And as I watched him sit there, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to fully accept until that moment. This wasn't just hard for him. It was necessary. Because for the first time in his life, comfort was no longer protecting him from reality. By the end of that week, the quiet resistance he had been holding inside started to break into something more visible again. Not the same as before, not careless or entitled in the way it used to be, but sharper, more intentional, like someone who was beginning to feel pressure and didn't know how to release it. He wasn't comfortable anymore, and that discomfort needed somewhere to go. And as expected, it came back toward me. That afternoon, he walked into the kitchen with a different kind of energy. Not slow, not uncertain, but direct. He didn't look around first. He didn't check the fridge. He came straight toward me, stood across from where I was sitting and said, "This has gone too far." His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, carrying something new, confrontation. And for a moment I just looked at him, not surprised, not defensive, just aware that this moment had been coming. "Nothing has gone too far," I replied calmly. "Things are just where they should have been a long time ago." And that answer didn't soften anything. It didn't open space for compromise. It drew a line, clear, steady, and impossible to misunderstand. He shook his head, pacing slightly now, his frustration no longer contained. "You think this is normal," he said, his voice rising just enough to show that control was slipping. "You just stop doing everything overnight and expect me to figure it out?" And there it was again, the expectation. Not of support, not of guidance, but of service returning. "I don't expect anything," I said, my tone unchanged. "You're the one who has to decide what you're going to do." And that shifted the weight completely. Because for the first time, the responsibility wasn't floating in the space between us. It was placed directly where it belonged. That was when the frustration turned into something more raw. "I don't have money like that," he said, his voice tighter now, no longer trying to sound in control. "I can't just go out and live like that overnight." And that sentence, that one revealed something deeper than anything he had said before. Not anger, not entitlement, reality starting to surface. "I know," I answered quietly. "That's why you need to start." No judgment, no sarcasm, just truth. He stopped pacing after that, stood still for a few seconds, as if trying to find something else to say, something that would shift the situation back into something familiar. But nothing came, because there was nothing left to argue against. This wasn't a discussion anymore. It wasn't about opinions or perspectives. It was about reality. And reality doesn't negotiate. He left the room shortly after that, but this time there was no dramatic exit, no loud reaction, no attempt to reclaim control through emotion. Just silence. Heavy, real, undeniable silence. And as I sat there, I realized something important. This wasn't about winning. This was about ending something that should have never continued this long. And whether he accepted it or not, that ending had already begun. By the beginning of the second week, the atmosphere in the house had changed in a way that couldn't be ignored anymore. It wasn't just tension now. It was weight. The kind that settles into every corner, into every silence, into every small interaction that used to be automatic and now required effort. He wasn't moving through the house the same way anymore. The casual confidence was gone. The sense of ownership over everything around him had faded, replaced by something more uncertain, more restrained. Almost like he didn't fully recognize his place anymore. I started noticing small things that, before, would have never existed. He would stand in the kitchen longer, looking at simple things like bread, eggs, or anything that required even the smallest effort to prepare. Not because he didn't know how, but because he had never needed to know. There's a difference between not knowing and never having to learn. And he was facing that difference now, in real time, without anyone stepping in to fill the gap for him. One morning I heard sounds in the kitchen earlier than usual. Not noon. Not late afternoon. Morning. Real morning. It wasn't loud, but it was unfamiliar enough to pull my attention. I didn't go immediately. I stayed where I was, listening, allowing the moment to exist without my presence interfering. There were pauses, small hesitations, the sound of something being dropped, picked up again, adjusted. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't confident. But it was happening. When I finally walked into the kitchen, he was there, standing by the stove, staring at something he was trying to cook, clearly unsure of what he was doing. He didn't look at me right away. And that, more than anything, told me everything. This wasn't performance. This wasn't manipulation. This was effort. Uncomfortable, unfamiliar effort. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. The silence wasn't tense this time. It was different. It carried something quieter. Something closer to reality settling in. "It's harder than it looks," he said finally, not defensive, not sarcastic, just honest. And that honesty, it was new. Not something I had heard from him in a long time. Maybe ever in this context. I nodded slightly, not stepping in, not correcting, not guiding. Just acknowledging. Because this moment wasn't about teaching him how to cook. It was about something much bigger. Learning how to take care of himself. And for the first time since all of this started, he wasn't resisting it. He was feeling it. That moment in the kitchen didn't change everything overnight. But it changed something deeper than anything that had happened before. Not in a dramatic way. not in a way that could be easily pointed out, but in the small shifts that only become visible when you're paying close attention. After that morning, he didn't go back to pretending nothing had changed. He didn't return to the old pattern of waiting, expecting, demanding. Instead, there was hesitation, pause between actions, a kind of awareness that hadn't been there before. Over the next few days, I noticed him trying more, not consistently, not perfectly, but enough to show that something inside him had started to move. He would go into the kitchen earlier, sometimes preparing something simple, sometimes failing and trying again, sometimes leaving things half done, but not walking away completely like he used to. The frustration was still there. I could see it in his expressions, in the way he would exhale sharply or shake his head when something didn't work the way he expected, but it wasn't directed at me anymore. It was directed at the situation, and more importantly at himself. And that shift was everything. Because as long as his frustration was pointed outward, nothing could change. But now, for the first time, he was starting to feel the gap between where he was and where he needed to be. And that gap creates movement. We didn't talk much during those days. Not because there was tension, but because there was something else happening. Something quieter. Space. Real space. Not the kind that comes from avoidance, but the kind that allows things to develop without interference. I didn't step in. I didn't offer advice. I didn't correct him when he made mistakes, even when it would have been easier, even when part of me wanted to. Because I understood something now that I hadn't understood before. Help, when given too early, becomes a replacement for growth. One afternoon, he came into the living room while I was reading, sat down for a moment, then stood up again, as if unsure of what he wanted to say. He stayed there for a few seconds, then finally spoke. "I didn't realize how much you were doing," he said. His voice quieter than usual, not filled with pride, not defensive, just honest. And those words, they didn't feel like an apology. They felt like awareness. I looked at him, not with relief, not with emotion, just steady, and said, "You didn't have to." And that answer wasn't meant to dismiss what he said. It was meant to show him something else. That the point wasn't recognition. It was responsibility. He nodded slightly after that, not fully understanding everything yet, but understanding enough. And for the first time since all of this started, he didn't walk away frustrated. He walked away thinking. The days that followed didn't feel like a return to normal. They felt like something new trying to take shape, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably real. He wasn't the same anymore, not in the way he moved, not in the way he spoke, and most of all, not in the way he related to the space around him. The house no longer revolved around him. And for the first time, he wasn't trying to force it to. That alone changed everything. He started leaving the house with purpose, not every day, not consistently at first, but enough to signal that something had shifted internally. He would get dressed earlier, not rushing, not avoiding, but preparing. There was still hesitation in his movements, still uncertainty in his decisions, but it wasn't avoidance anymore. It was effort, real effort, the kind that doesn't look impressive from the outside, but carries weight because of what it represents. And I didn't ask where he was going. I didn't question what he was doing, because this wasn't about monitoring progress. It was about allowing it. One afternoon, he came back home with something small in his hand, nothing significant, nothing that would stand out to anyone else, but to me, it meant everything. Groceries, simple things, bread, eggs, a few basics. He walked into the kitchen, placed them on the counter, and for a second he just stood there, as if unsure of what came next. Not because he didn't know what to do, but because he wasn't used to being the one who had to decide. "I got these," he said, not looking at me directly. His voice calm, almost neutral, but underneath it, there was something else. Not pride, not expectation, just acknowledgement. I nodded slightly, not overreacting, not turning it into something bigger than it needed to be, because I understood something now. This wasn't about praise. It was about ownership. And ownership doesn't need validation to grow. It needs space. That evening, for the first time in years, I didn't prepare anything. And neither did he expect me to. Instead, he moved around the kitchen on his own, slower than someone experienced, less efficient, but fully present. There were mistakes, small ones, nothing serious, but he didn't walk away from them. He corrected them. He adjusted. He stayed with the process. And as I watched quietly, without interfering, without guiding, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to fully feel until that moment. This wasn't just about him changing. This was about me stepping back far enough for him to finally step forward. The shift didn't arrive with celebration or some clear moment where everything suddenly made sense. It settled in quietly, almost naturally, like something that had been waiting to exist for a long time but never had the space. By that point, the house felt different in a way that couldn't be explained with simple words. It wasn't just about routines changing or responsibilities shifting. It was about balance. Something that had been missing for years had finally found its place again. He wasn't perfect. He still moved slower than someone used to responsibility, still hesitated at times, still struggled with things that most people his age would consider basic. But the difference now was undeniable. He stayed with it. He didn't walk away. He didn't wait for someone else to step in. When something needed to be done, he faced it, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it took longer than it should. And that willingness, that was the real change. We still didn't talk much about what had happened. Not because it was being ignored, but because it didn't need to be explained anymore. The lesson wasn't in words. It was in experience. In the quiet understanding that had formed between us without needing to be spoken out loud. And sometimes, that kind of understanding is stronger than anything that could be said. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, he came in, not with hesitation this time, but with something more grounded. He sat down across from me, not rushing, not avoiding, just present. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke, but the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was calm. And then he said something simple. Something that, months earlier, would have never crossed his mind. "I think I'm going to look for something full-time," he said. His voice steady, not uncertain, not defensive, just decided. I looked at him, not surprised, not emotional, just aware of what that sentence meant. Not just the words themselves, but everything behind them. The process, the discomfort, the resistance, change. "That's a good idea," I said quietly. No lecture, no reminder, no reinforcement, just acknowledgement. He nodded, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't see a boy waiting for life to happen to him. I saw someone starting to move toward it. And that difference was everything. The decision he made that evening didn't transform everything overnight, but it changed the direction of everything that came after. And direction matters more than speed. Over the next few days, I started noticing a different kind of energy in him, something more focused, more intentional. He wasn't just reacting to the situation anymore. He was moving within it. He woke up earlier not because anyone told him to, but because he needed to. He started looking at things differently, not as obstacles but as steps. Small ones, sometimes uncertain, sometimes slow. But steps forward. I didn't ask how it was going. I didn't follow up. I didn't check on his progress. Because this wasn't something that needed supervision anymore. And deep down, I think he understood that too. For the first time, he wasn't doing something because someone expected him to. He was doing it because he had reached a point where not doing it was no longer an option. There were still difficult moments, of course. Days when he came back quiet, days when things didn't go the way he wanted, days when frustration returned. But this time, it didn't turn into blame. It didn't come back toward me. He carried it differently. He processed it. And that alone told me more than any words ever could. One afternoon, he walked in a little earlier than usual, holding something in his hand again. Not groceries this time. Papers. He placed them on the table, not dramatically, not seeking attention, just present. "I got something," he said, his voice calm, steady. I looked at the papers, then at him, and even before he said anything else, already knew. "It's not much," he added, almost instinctively, as if preparing himself for disappointment. But I shook my head slightly before he could continue. "It's yours," I said. And that was enough. 'Cause for the first time, it wasn't about how big the step was. It was about the fact that he took it. That night, after everything had settled, after the house returned to its quiet rhythm, I found myself sitting alone again, just like I had done so many times before. But this time it felt completely different. The silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't filled with thoughts I was trying to avoid or questions I didn't want to answer. It was calm, clear, earned. For years, I believed that loving my son meant making things easier for him, removing obstacles, protecting him from discomfort, doing whatever it took to make sure he didn't struggle. I thought that was what a good mother did. I thought sacrifice meant giving more, even when there was nothing left. But sitting there, in that quiet moment, I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. Love doesn't prepare someone for life by removing difficulty. It prepares them by allowing them to face it. And for a long time, I had taken that away from him. Not out of neglect, not out of indifference, but out of love that didn't know where to stop. But love that doesn't have boundaries doesn't build strength. It builds dependence. And the hardest part wasn't changing him. It was changing me. Letting go of the role I had lived in for so long. Allowing silence where I used to fill space. Allowing discomfort where I used to fix everything. Allowing him to become responsible for his own life. I don't know exactly what his future will look like. I don't know how far he will go or how long it will take. But I know this. For the first time, his life belongs to him. And for the first time in years, mine belongs to me again. If you've ever loved someone and had to stop helping them to save them, subscribe. Because stories like this aren't just stories. They're reality for more people than you think.